Welcome. We are excited for this conversation. My name is Patricia Mota. I'm currently serving as President and CEO of HACE, the Hispanic Alliance for Career Enhancement, and we are going to get into discussing the importance of programs and initiatives that encourage and support opportunities for growth, professional development, and promotion within companies, specifically for Hispanic, Latinx talents. We're also going to discuss in terms of what are some of the barriers and opportunities for increasing representation into senior level roles, including best practices and the experience that we have here of the panelists that we have with us joining. So we are going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with Robert Rodriguez on this first question. Regarding why is there a lack of Hispanic representation in senior level roles? What are some of the factors and barriers preventing from promotions?
Well, thank you, Patricia. Yeah, it's a topic that's, I've spent, decades kind of studying and, trying to get a sense of, why isn't there more Latinx, Hispanic representation in leadership? A couple things have come up. One is, we're finding that as a community, we tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored, right? We, have lots of individuals, giving advice to their Latinx talent. Hey, you should do this, and you should do this, consider this, which is great. I know I've benefited greatly throughout my career by having some wonderful mentors. But what in talking with Hispanic professionals, a lot of times they say, hey, I have lots of mentors giving me advice, but I don't think I have folks advocating on my behalf. So I think that lack of sponsorship of Hispanic talent has really kind of prevented, some of us from kind of cracking into that C-suite. As we all know, mentors talk to you, sponsors talk about you, right? So I think one thing to kind of accelerate the promotional velocity of our Hispanic talent is try to say, hey, how do we, elevate the visibility and exposure of our Hispanic talent, so that way senior executives, will they'll appear on their radar and impress them to the point where that executive will say, hey, that person's ready for that promotion, or have we considered her, for this key assignment, right? So they're kind of advocating for us, particularly in those talent reviews. And then the other thing that's kind of been bubbling up a little bit recently is that, when companies do identify upwardly mobile Hispanic talents, there's kind of been a tendency to kind of steer them more towards staff roles, right? To say, oh, look at Robert, he's doing a great job. Wouldn't he be great in government affairs? Wouldn't he be great in corporate communications? And again, I'm not marginalizing those roles; those are important roles. But we all know, Patricia, that in order to get to the C-suite, you need to be able to run a business, right? You need P&L experience. So we've seen that kind of be a hurdle that has kind of come up, that not only organizations have to try to provide those P&L responsibilities, but also for our Latinx talent, we need to seek those roles out. So I think if we do a better job in those two areas, it'll start to accelerate the number of Hispanic leaders in those vice president and C-suite roles.
Thank you, Robert. And I'll ask any of our fellow panelists to please weigh in if you have anything to add. And what we're talking about is on some of the statistics. When you look at C-suite positions, we have less than 3% of C-suite level positions in the Fortune 500 companies, for example, are represented by Hispanics. And for Latinas, it's less than that, less than 1%. And so that's at that level. And then as you look further down and you break it down, you start to see some of the other statistics. So anybody else have anything to weigh on this particular question?
Patricia, you mean the first one, right? The first question you asked. Yeah, I mean, I think Robert has been instrumental in helping us think through our D&I strategy in our company. And Pradheepa worked for Stanley Black & Decker with the 4C model and everything. Thank you, Robert. And it was very insightful. I will also ask leaders to think about the talent from Latin American countries, right, as potential global leaders. If you think about the environment we operate in, it has become very uncertain. Typically, when you put people in global roles for US headquartered companies, they will look for US-based experience as a primary skill set. But if you think about what is that one critical skill set you need today, is that ability to work in uncertain environments and thrive in that, right? Like that agility. I'm not saying that only Latin Americans bring that, but they definitely, people who have experience in Latin American countries they definitely bring those skill sets. So if you work for global companies and you are trying to place, that's a great skill set to have, and they can learn the other skill sets, right? So my point it's just an addition to what Robert was talking about, just building on that. We have to get a little bit innovative about how to stretch high potential talent and give them roles. That's really critical, irrespective of what racial category we are talking about, underrepresented racial category we are talking about. A little bit of innovation and stretching is always needed. And that way they can prove themselves. The strengths they bring to the table could be very relevant for what the world is going through right now. Thank you.
Wonderful points. Thank you, Pradheepa. We talked a little bit, Robert, right, about being overly mentored, under-sponsored, and the need to really support talent within the organization, but also with the organization to be able to really internally look at what are some of the ways that they can pull talent, stretch talent internally as well. And so my next question to build on that looks specifically at Latinas. And I mentioned when you look at the data and the statistics, not only is it bad in representation in terms of percentage for Latinos in general, but when you look at the women, it's even worse, right? And so, Jarvis, my question for you is in regards to this, how does this affect Latinas in particular?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Patricia, and thank you so much, team, for having us here as part of this conversation. When we think about the experiences of Latinas finding themselves at the intersection of both female identities as well as being Latina and the experiences of marginalized communities in the space, what this means in terms of navigating corporate culture becomes that much more difficult. The unfortunate reality is the majority of corporate culture center around the need to drive closer toward cultural assimilation, as opposed to actually owning and accepting the unique cultural identities that we desire out of our teammates. And you'll see this juxtaposed a lot by some of the work that companies are taking around hiring and recruiting, where we feel comfortable showing up at spaces like Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, showing up in partnership with the Alumni Society. And yet when it's time to bring folks to the conversation and at the company, it's a far different experience. This is an area, though, that companies need to obsess, and it's a big area of focus for us at Nike. The Department of Labor did a really great study on some stats that they released, highlighting that the current representation of Latinas in the workforce is right around 7.2%. And we know that when we look year over year at what growth looks like, that's only continuing to expand, with estimations being around 8.5% just in the next 2 years. Latinas are also have the greatest promotion velocity and potential in terms of women that are graduating with 4-year degrees right now of any group of representative populations of women. What that means is that significant investment must be put into play to see development and promotion uniquely linked to each other. But what this means is that the company needs to think internally around the relevant shift in culture that's needed. For example, assimilation in this construct of culture fit cannot be the essence of the work. As Pradheepa highlighted, thinking about experiences of Latinas as global leaders means that we need to start obsessing bilingualism and biculturalism that much more, such that we're creating spaces and environments where Latinas can show up fully within that cultural identity and really thrive. One of the topics that we're navigating currently is rooted in a lot of research that's been recently released by many consulting firms, which highlights that for Latino professionals that have so-called strong accents, 89% of them felt overlooked in career advancement purely because of that. We have to reassess and reevaluate the priority that we place on core competencies to do a role, the ability for this to drive global leadership, and how we position Latinas in positions where they can grow and develop, defining new standards. The unfortunate reality is that a lot of Latinas feel so bound by the need to conform to traditionally white male standards in corporate organizations that it leads to separation or disconnect, which doesn't only impact ability toward development and promotion, but ultimately impacts retention, which I'm sure will be a great topic of conversation in the other panel.
Absolutely. And quickly, Patricia, if I can just build on that, I was just talking to a Latina the other day, and she's originally from Latin America, and she has somewhat of an accent, and she said she was talking to an executive, and the executive says, I don't know if you can do this role, you can have a heavy accent. And I loved her rebuttal. She said, well, guess what? More and more of our customers have accents, right? As folks see our community as a catalyst for economic growth, now her Hispanic heritage and our, biculturalism and our bilingualness becomes an asset in the social districts. I just love that. So I had to share that.
No, and Robert, if I can just build on both what you and Jarvis said, and Jarvis specifically used this term that we really have to be cognizant of. And that's this notion of culture fit, right? Because when we say culture fit, what we're really saying is, are you like the rest of us, is what you're really saying. So when we think about what are some things that we can do internally as an organization from a leadership perspective, is change some of our language, right? And so in the context of, we're not looking for a culture fit. What we're looking for is a culture add. A culture add. What is a person culturally going to add to our organization that we don't have today? And when we start to think about that, then we start to look for things that are different than what we typically look for. And when you look for those things, you typically end up with something different than what you would typically look for as well. And this whole notion of how we show up. Culturally, we show up differently. People of color typically are a little bit more engaging, a little bit more, in a lot of cases, gregarious. Robert, you just talked about this whole notion of, spoke with an accent. In many cases, we may speak with our hands, and we may be a little bit more animated. That, to Jarvis's point, that's outside the norm. And so that creates this notion of, well, I don't know how they would show up in the boardroom. I don't know, and people get uncomfortable with that. Well, we have to help people that understand that culture is the very essence of not only who we are as a person, but when we talk about being relevant with all of our customers have those things. And I don't know, it's this whole notion of when we get animated, and especially from a Latino or Latinx perspective, I think it's, ¿cómo se dice? No estoy enojado, solo soy apasionado, right? I'm not mad, I'm just passionate, right?
Love that.
And that should be viewed as a good thing. So I'll just stop there.
All great points. I appreciate everybody adding on. I think, reminds me too, I just had a conversation from one of our programs, the Mujeres de HACE, which is our Latina leadership program, who said that her experience in going through the program enabled her to go back to her workplace and asked her employer to change, to call her Leti versus Letty. And something like that in terms of, and she never felt confident enough to be able to do so, but being able to go through a training that empowers her to really become and leverage her true self, her true identity, how she prefers to be identified, right? I think is critical in creating that culture of inclusion and belonging. There's also research done by the Center for Talent Innovation about 2 years ago that stated that 76% of Latinos in the workplace repress some part of their persona, whether it's how you pronounce your name, whether it's your hair, the food you eat. And so the more that we're able to provide environments and inclusion in terms of where employees feel that they can share these things about them, the more we empower them to lead and to feel comfortable leading within the organization. And so my next point here is regarding specific to what are some of the practices, right? So we've talked a little bit about what are some of the barriers, what are some of the challenges, particularly for Latinos and Latinas in the workplace. What are some of the development practices or programs that support the readiness for promotions? And so, James, I'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you for that. And again, thank you for having me. As I go back to the first question around some of the barriers, and Robert talked about this notion of over-mentored and under-sponsored. And my personal belief is what happens is people are mentored, that's great, but that sponsorship in terms of putting your name on somebody, in order to do that, that comes from a different place. And so we have to create opportunities for that to take place. And when I say it comes from a different place, I will put my name on, I will sponsor someone that I have the art with, someone that I have an authentic relationship that has led to trust with. I will sponsor that person. I'll mentor a lot of people, but I'll sponsor the person that I have the art with. And so if we can get to this notion of building authentic relationships that lead to trust, that helps people sponsor people. So what are ways you can do that? A couple of ways that that we do it is, my personal favorite is reverse mentorships. Now, there's the mentorship, which is the leader speaks down, gives coaching and guidance and feedback to the subordinate. But the reverse mentorship takes the weight off the shoulders of the leader and says, leader, what your role is in this mentorship process is you're the learner. The leader is the learner. And the goal of that leader in that learning in reverse mentorship is get to know someone who's different than them. Get to know them. How did they grow up? What's their background? Where do they come from? And start to build these bridges and these connections that lead to authentic relationships that lead to trust. So that's one of my favorite ways. Other ways you can do that is you can do that with what we call seat at the table. And that's where you take folks who may not be in that function, but you put them at the table with other leaders and you specifically ask for their perspectives because you expect them to be different and you give folks permission to do that. You want those folks in the room and you're asking for them to give their perspective. And what's happening in that room is people who aren't necessarily doing this part of the work, but they're giving their perspective. We get to hear how they think. We get to hear how they learn. We get to see how they engage. And that starts to connect those connections. And then finally, this notion of STAs or short-term assignments, where you take people out of their current job and allow them to go spend time in different parts of the business. Two things happen. If I go do that short-term assignment, I'm not signing up to live there for the rest of my life. I'm going to go check it out and try it and see if I like it. The function is doing the same thing, checking out, trying me, see if they like me. And if we have a match, things work out. If we don't have a match, me as the person who's doing the STA, I still walk away with some more insight, knowledge, and skill sets that I can take to other places in the business. So those are, just a few things or a few ideas that I think work for us.
Thank you, James. And the other thing to consider these days we were talking about earlier is how do we implement these practices successfully on top of what do we call the war on talent that's going on right now? what are some of the other things that need to be considered? And then the other layer being, that's also equitable and culturally relevant to the individual, and specifically for Latinos, right? I think a lot of what we talk about at HACE, and I know Dr. Robert Rodriguez also talks about, are some of the traditional cultural values and norms, especially for first generation Latino, Latinx coming into the workplace, that has to also, adjust those barriers, and how are we ensuring that those practices are meeting those individuals, not just as a group, right, but individually, right? And I think that there's so many intersectional and identities and layers to all of this. And so I say that out loud to say if anybody has anything to add to all the great things that James mentioned.
I'll add, one of the things, and it reminded me of this, James, as you were speaking, that, not that long ago, right before COVID, I had a client approach me and say, Robert, we want to create a Latino experience, not just for our C-suite executives, but also our board. It was a banking institution. They do, a lot of business in the Hispanic Latino community. And they realized that we just don't know a lot about this community, right? So, so I spent a whole weekend with them. If you're here in Chicago where I am, Friday night we had dinner in the Pilsen neighborhood, predominantly Mexican area, Mexican restaurant. We brought in Maria Hinojosa from Latino USA to speak to them. Saturday, we spent it in Little Village, visited the Little Village Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Then we went over to Humboldt Park, which is a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood, and we walked the Paseo Boricua there. We did in the late afternoon, we had panel sessions with Latino nonprofit board leaders. And then over dinner, we ate dinner at a Peruvian restaurant. We had Latinos and Latinas on corporate boards, talk to them about their experience. And then on Sunday, we brought in, Sylvia Puente, the Latino, policy forum, talk about, Latinos in housing and issues. And then we ended up at the National Museum of Mexican Art. And those executives, after those 3 days, they just had a much more textured understanding of and appreciation for not only the community, but also where are the issues with the demographic, and more importantly, how can they effectively not only serve that community, but how can they guide their Latinx talent by creating those bridges of understanding that you were talking about, James. So I'm hoping more companies do those sorts of experiences.
I think it's such a powerful point, Robert. As I think about experiences of what we've built at Nike, a lot of times when we do this work, it centers so heavily around the talent themselves and what we need to develop or what we need to coach within or around the talent, when a lot of it we can gain significant headway by thinking about our own internal people processes and the work of the folks that are sitting in current state decision-making power. And so exactly what you described, Robert, of these cultural experiences, we believe education is a critical prerequisite to starting to build great impact here. And for a lot of folks, they are existing in a state of ignorance, of a lack of cultural knowledge, competency, and understanding of not only the historical, but also the sociological elements of what it means to be Latino in America and some of the nuances of navigating corporate landscapes because of that. And so we focus on a couple of areas specifically around integration. So within our talent management practice, for talent planning in May of 2021, we actually did an integrated session where we brought in senior leaders from the outside to speak to our executive leadership team and their plus ones about some of these corporate experiences, having deep and real talk conversations around microaggressive experiences that Latinos feel in the workplace and how we think about the onus and role that each of us needs to play to overcome that. Far too often, the experiences are placed on the marginalized communities to be the ones to both identify the problem, help focus on solutions, and then ultimately be the guinea pig in a lot of these pilot-based programs to drive the work. Whereas the rationale is finding the same level of obsession that we have in the promotion of Latino athletes, actors, actresses, entertainers, those in media, politics, and otherwise, and create that same level of obsession for Latino talent. Put simply, as brand companies, we understand promotion. Promotion is what we do. Starting to apply some of those same standards that we deploy in business operations in terms of promotion of people, strategies, approaches, needs to be the same rigor that we think about in engaging our teams and talent, which starts with figuring out who's in power.
Ooh. Stop it now. Okay.
Powerful.
Let me just build on Jarvis's point. His last point around this whole notion of we're promotions, we're brands, we promote things. Why wouldn't we leverage the same type of agencies, cultural agencies, all those things and dollars and thinking and mindsets that we use to promote the product? If you use those same skill sets, those same agencies, those same level of thinking around this space, around people, you mess around and you connect between your talent base, your consumer, and your business holistically. And when you do that, you get to a whole nother level. But we just don't think about this whole notion of equity, inclusive belonging the same way we think about the broader business. It's getting there now because, as we know, the demographics are changing very, very quickly. And what we understand in this war for talent is people want to see people not in the company who look like them. They want to see people in leadership who look like them. And especially to Jarvis's point around this whole notion of education, highly educated talent. In fact, in many cases, there's an organization called the Consortium for Graduate Studies and Management. Some of the top, the best schools in the country. And what they're telling these underrepresented people of color who are going to school to get their MBAs and things of that nature, when they're like, who should I interview with? Who should I internship with? And what their schools are telling them is, go to their website, look at their leadership and see what it looks like. Look at their board and see what it looks like. Let that be one of your guides.
Yeah, and here we're going back to the war on talent, right? They want to be able to see themselves represented in leadership roles. And the other big one, and especially for underrepresented communities, is purpose and meaning. So how are we as employers really showcasing that through these leaders, right? And we know that we still have some time to go, and organizations like HACE, the work that Robert is doing, is really pushing for that. But what's the interim, right? James, you mentioned a great point, is that they want to be able to see themselves represented with their company. But if they're currently not there, what are the outlets, the organizations, the resources to be able to ensure that you're putting those executives in front of them so that they say, they may not be at my company, but I see that this person has got there and I see myself getting there, right? And so our programs, such as what we're doing with our emerging leaders, our Mujeres de HACE Women's Leadership Program, we have a graduate go through our virtual program. His company, he's based out of Alabama, Puerto Riqueño, proud Puerto Rican, but he wasn't a proud Puerto Rican before, you know, in terms of his company. They didn't know he was Puerto Rican. He didn't really talk about it, but it wasn't through the experience going through our leadership training that he's like, you know, I saw myself represented across other companies and organizations, and it empowered me to go back, be my authentic self, but then advance in my career and get promoted within a couple of months. And so it's about what are some of the resources and opportunities that we need to consider. And from an HR perspective, Pradheepa, my question for you is, what is the role of HR and management when it comes to the promotion process within the organization?
Thank you, Patricia. First of all, thank you so much for having us here. You know, I want to start by saying, before I answer the question, I think I feel really privileged, especially around this topic, right? I actually work for EVP and president, the head of the business unit is Hispanic. He's from Colombia. I am surrounded by numerous really powerful female leaders in the organization who are Hispanic. So different countries, it's clearly an ethnic representation, right? Like you have so many different countries and represented in this group, but just brilliant individuals to the extent that I was so inspired by them, and I went to Duolingo and started learning Spanish for a period of time. I did good for 150 days. I need to pick it up again. But on that note, I'm privileged. But I'll give you the HR programs and strategies that can help organization. It's going to encompass a lot of things Robert, James, and Jarvis talked about, right? Everything starts with attraction. You need to showcase that you have representation. This is going to be the biggest minority group, 30% by, is it 2060? I could be wrong, 2050. So it's going to be the biggest minority group. And your representation, we talk about representation and leadership being at 4.3% in corporate America. That has to change. If you want to create a change, you need to think about the board. You need to think about your C-level. You need to think about your VPs. You need to think about your managers, all the way through early career talents. And you need to start building different strategies to increase representation at all levels. So you have to have a combination of attraction strategy, right? You need to attract talents. You need to develop talent within your organization. You need to be a company where this talent feels like they belong and they want to stay. So there should be better retention strategies. So that's the first thing I would say. A lot of the sponsorship program is something we started small and we have scaled significantly. I actually think it's a great program, right? Like Robert talked about it. And we have incorporated reverse mentorship as part of that. I think James talked about that. These are strategies. These are proven strategies, right? Because if you think about it, this is something that the majority group, white male, has used more organically to promote their talents. So you are creating programs that mimics these organic things that have happened for decades or hundreds of years, and you come up with something that works. It accelerates the growth. It gives them experience and exposure and learning from leaders. Otherwise, this match wouldn't happen. So sponsorship programs are fantastic. Cohort-based leadership development programs, making sure people get those experiences, giving rotational programs. Hey, go and learn something else. Okay, you're doing this today, great. You've gained the skill set. You have a fantastic work ethic. You have a curious mind. You have these basic skill set. You can go and do something else. So giving those different kinds of rotations, helping them work in projects, as it was mentioned, I think is very important. The one other thing that I would say around development is, what takes you to a certain level versus if you go to the next level of leadership, there is a level of reinvention that has to happen. Like, especially if you are at a VP level and you want to move to that C level, that's the most difficult transition someone is going to make. And I know that all levels of transitions are difficult because just there is a very small group of individuals who get to the C-level. So that reinvention, for that to happen, that has to be concerted efforts organization puts in, like exposure to board members, very focused approach to exposure to board members, giving exposure to investors, listening in investor calls. All those things are, I think, very, very important. So focus. Organizations have to take their responsibility and focus beyond the individual and their current role and think about pathways that can give them various experience that takes them all the way to the C-level. And representation matters. That's why you need to not only depend on developing talent, you have to attract talent. Because I personally have, a lot of the examples that Robert, James, and Jarvis were talking about, people have told me when I started in corporate America 21 years back, hey, you talk very fast. Nobody understands what you're saying. You use your hands. And these things are like, I have heard this and I have tried to adjust to a certain degree. And because I become so conscious, it was not working. And then I told myself, you know what? This is me. I'm going to bring my old self to work. So those biases exist, right? So you have to prepare the, platform to remove that bias, to talk about this cultural ad concept that James talked about. So, I think that the leaders who went before me, they actually said a lot of things that was just powerful. So I'm referring back and reinforcing those, right? And it's not just my experience. I actually talked to one of the Hispanic, very strong leaders who used to be our CMO, and she's running a big business unit right now. And she told me that how fast she talks and she's Hispanic, and she said, was criticized by one of her previous managers, not in our company, previous company she worked for. But these are biases we need to remove because these are not barriers. It's just in our mind. That's one thing. And then the sense of belonging, right? Like you need to have a critical mass in your company for people to feel like they belong. Your company has to be purpose-driven, creating products and innovation that's focused on this customer base, making sure they are serving the community and this base. You look at your customer base, and this is a big representation for a company like ours, an industrial and a tools and storage company. Hispanic community is a big customer base for us. And we have to make sure our representation is looking similar. We have to think about, we are developing products, we are contributing to the society in similar ways.
And you've summed up like our entire conversation. I think we can wrap it up there. That's amazing, Pradheepa. Thank you for all of that. We talked about, building more inclusive organizations, and that means that that training, which is around building that self-awareness training, because I believe that the more self-aware you are, the more inclusive you are as a leader, right? So it's not just from the top, but making sure organizational wide that's happening for those that we want to move up and from those that are at the top, right? And then the business imperative, right? We're looking at a 1.7 trillion purchasing power from this particular community, 2.7 trillion GDP, which by the way, Latinas are running about 80% of that, right? In terms of key decision makers in the household. And so just key for so many reasons that we are not only ensuring that we have representation at the top, but that we're ensuring that this is a business imperative and that's understood across the board. So we have a few minutes left, I think, until we wrap it up. And my last question before we summarize and wrap up is, what are some of the best practices? And Robert, I'll swing this to you, that you've seen implemented that have resulted in the promotion of more Hispanic employees.
Thank you for that. A couple of things I've been pretty impressed with lately. I know, for example, our friends at JP Morgan Chase, they actually have a global head whose role is to advance their Hispanic talent. That's her full-time job, right? So she looks at their talent management systems, the leadership pipeline, succession planning, all those things. And I just love that, to have a dedicated resource where that's their job. Now I get it. This is all of our jobs, but it shows a commitment by the company. It says, hey, we're doing this. Another one is, and I won't share the name of the company, but when we're talking about C-suite roles and vice president roles, a lot of companies, if they don't have the talent, they have to go out and buy that talent, right? And they use search firms, right? And this particular company, they hired a search firm, and that search firm actually called me and said, hey, Robert, do you know of any Hispanic talent we want to? And I'm like, isn't that your job as a search firm to know? And this, recruiter actually said, hey, we don't know the Latino talent, right? So eventually I think that got back to the client, said, hey, why are we using a search firm that doesn't know the talent in this community? So it kind of goes back to what Jarvis said earlier. Look at your vendors, look at your partners, who's kind of going into that. And then of course, I can't leave the call without, just a plug for these cultural-based, leadership development programs. Kudos to has the HACE and all the leadership development programs you have. I think it's important to elevate the cultural awareness of what is a Latino cultural script, right? And how does our Hispanic heritage influence possibly how we show up, in the workplace? I think by getting Latinos more comfortable in their own skin and leveraging their Hispanic heritage as an asset and source of strength, I think that's going to continue to bode well. So, part of, I'm always excited when I see all those great sponsors that are supporting your programs and some of the ones that I do, because, as I look to wrap up my thoughts, the workforce of the future is going to have an increasingly Latino identity, right? So companies need to promote and have talent that represents that community. Those are just some of the things I've seen lately that I've been impressed with.
Thank you, Robert. Anybody else have anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. The focus on talent spotlight. One of the big challenges for marginalized communities is just the visibility within our companies. And so ensuring that the executive leadership team and their plus ones have direct line of sight to who the individuals are, who the high performing talent is, so that they can ultimately be a part of the journey of helping this talent continue to advance. Second, career mobility is absolutely critical. At Nike, we recognize that the largest proportion of our Hispanic and Latino populations are sitting in our retail stores. And so getting to know those teammates and understanding their career aspirations for either retail leadership or corporate development is going to be key. I'd be remiss to not talk about one of my good friends, Juan Huerta, who works in our design organization. He entered Nike through the Serena Williams Design Crew apprenticeship program. He had worked in Nike retail for more than 5 years, applied to be a part of this apprenticeship, and after 6 months of designing footwear, apparel, and equipment, namely on the digital side for Serena, he's now a designer one working in our corporate space and living out here in Beaverton, Oregon. It's the obsession of going to where the talent is, deconstructing barriers and focusing on access and equity that makes the biggest difference. But finally, and I think this panel that we're part of today is a direct illumination of that, ensuring that Hispanic and Latino populations don't feel that they have to exist in an echo chamber to have these conversations. I love the rich diversity of all of us on this call, coming from distinct and unique racial and ethnic backgrounds and experiences, gender identities, sexual orientations, and beyond. What it demonstrates is that although I identify as a Black man, my platform, power, and impact has to extend to support Hispanic and Latino communities, and the knowledge of understanding the impact that Latinas are currently making in present and will make on the future has to be a part of the broader narrative for the scope and impact that the role that I sit in can actually make. And then joining forces as allies with Latino leaders within the company to help advance the narrative and agenda. Owning humbly the fact that I don't know everything about the culture of the community, but am committed to learning more, being a part of the conversation, and entering in solidarity with using my voice.
And that's the attitude. I love it, because I always say at ASE, we are Latino serving. We're not Latino exclusive, because it's going to take everyone to ensure that we're building more inclusive, equitable spaces, not only for this community, but for all that are underrepresented at the top. And one thing that I would add, like with our programs, and we talked about Mujeres de ASE, emerging leaders, is we've tracked that within less than 6 months of graduating the program, 40% report a promotion increase of pay. And that goes up an additional 30%. So meaning all within less than 1 year, our graduates from our program, 70% are getting promoted and increase of pay at their place of employment. And so we're proud of the programming that we're doing, the work that's being done here with our esteemed panelists. And so with this last 30 seconds, I'll ask you to say one word or share a resource with our audience so we can take it home and wrap it up. I'll start with you, Jarvis.
We love our partnership with the Alumni Society. Engage with them if you're not already.
Awesome. James?
What I would say is embed equity, inclusion, belonging throughout the culture in your organization and make it something that's democratized, that accountability, to the point where when it comes time to bonus, equity, inclusion, belonging is a part of that.
Got it. Pradheepa?
Be bold. Be yourself. Bring your whole self to work.
And Robert?
And of course, invest in your Latinx Hispanic talent, whether it's who has the ASE program and all the great leadership programs that ASE has. I know myself and Angel Gomez, we have the Latino Leadership Intensive, similar programs to what ASE has. Ours are hosted at, Stanford University, Harvard University, University of Chicago. But, all that requires an investment. So continue to invest in your Latinx talent.
Thank you to each of you. Thank you to Claudia and the Hispanic Promise team for the invitation.